By the beginning of 1944, the balance of the war had shifted decisively against Germany, particularly in the east, where the Red Army had advanced steadily after Stalingrad and then Kursk. But to relieve pressure, Stalin had demanded a second front in the west, and this was initially agreed to at Casablanca in January 1943. So as a result, hundreds of thousands of American, British and Commonwealth troops mustered across southern England, poised for the greatest amphibious invasion in history, preceded by 13,000 US paratroopers and 11,000 more from Britain and the Commonwealth, dropping behind enemy lines a few hours earlier. This was D-Day, that began at daybreak on the 6th of June, 1944, when, after a 24-hour delay due to bad weather, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy. A vast fleet of more than 5,000 ships and landing craft, protected by some 11,000 aircraft, supported the invasion, and by the end of the day, around 156,000 Allied troops had landed in France. This took place across 5 codenamed beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, stretching some 50 miles along the Normandy coast. American troops from the 1st and the 29th Infantry Divisions at Omaha Beach suffered the worst of the fighting, cut down by the battle-hardened 352nd Infantry Division, whose machine gun nests were dug into steep bluffs high above the exposed beach. At Omaha, around 2,000 to 3,000 American casualties were suffered on D-Day, including roughly 1,000 killed, with many shot down in the shallows before even reaching the shore. Air and naval support proved decisive, although General Eisenhower and Field Marshal Montgomery, his field commander, were also aided by Hitler's conviction that the real Allied invasion would come further east, near Pas-de-Calais. By the 12th of June, a single bridgehead had been formed from the 5 beachheads, with 850,000 troops landed by the end of the month. A breakout took longer than had been expected, but victory at the Battle of Falaise allowed the Allies to begin a general advance across northern France, a task made easier after Rommel, Germany's most successful general, was seriously injured when his car was machine-gunned by Allied aircraft. The Allied advance was further bolstered by penicillin. By 1945, the drug was 20 times more powerful than the original 1940 form, proving vital in staving off gangrene during the average 12-hour wait for field surgery. Eisenhower's job was complicated by simmering professional and personal rivalry between the cautious Montgomery and the flamboyant Patton. General Patton led the US Third Army first southeast before turning north in an attempt to encircle the enemy, while at the beginning of August, a German counterattack was stopped in its tracks after Montgomery rushed troops to the point of attack, having received decoded intel from Bletchley Park. On the 25th of August 1944, all this allowed General Charles de Gaulle to lead Free French and Allied troops into liberated Paris, while 10 days later, Brussels was also freed. In the east, further Soviet advances took the Red Army into the Baltic states before moving on into Poland. By August, it had reached the outskirts of the Polish capital, where the Warsaw Uprising liberated over 2/3 of the city by October. But with Stalin refusing to help non-communists, extra SS reinforcements slowly brought the Poles to their knees, with over 150,000 dying before the Red Army finally entered the city in January 1945. In the west, Patton's army captured the industrially important Saarland in November, a catastrophic blow to the German war machine, already strangled by a critical lack of oil. Further north, Montgomery had ordered Operation Market Garden in September 1944, aiming to take key river crossings in the Netherlands, hoping to open up a direct route into Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, and end the war. This was ultimately unsuccessful when 10,000 paratroopers of the British 1st Airborne Division, supported by Polish volunteers, after 10 days of vicious fighting, failed to seize the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem, the bridge too far. This left 1,000 Allied troops dead, with a further 6,500 forced to surrender. For the people of the Netherlands, this meant suffering what became known as Hunger Winter, a few more terrible months under Nazi occupation. However, these did not include Anne Frank, who had been sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau in September 1944 with her sister, before being transferred to Bergen-Belsen a month later. Both died there in the last weeks of the war from typhus. The diary that Anne Frank had written during her years of hiding in Amsterdam were published posthumously by her father, the only member of the Frank family to survive the Holocaust. Stopping the Allies at Arnhem gave the German army a chance to regroup, and with Hitler still retaining the loyalty and devotion of the German people, he took the Allies by surprise on December the 16th, 1944, counterattacking with 250,000 troops, driving a wedge between Montgomery and Patton. But the Battle of the Bulge faltered after only a few weeks, ultimately doomed by German industry's failure to supply the resources needed to sustain such a bold plan. So by early January 1945, this last great Nazi blitzkrieg had been contained, and by the time that Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt met at Yalta for their second Great Power Conference at the beginning of February, the Allies once again had control of the West. As the enemy closed in on the Thousand-Year Reich, the bombing campaign that had devastated Germany since 1943 intensified, reaching a controversial peak in February with the joint firebombing of Dresden, killing some 25,000 people. As the beleaguered German people suffered, Patton's armies crossed into the Ruhr on the 23rd of February, severing Hitler's last supply lines. The final Soviet offensive on Berlin was launched on the 16th of April 1945 and was met with frantic resistance from German soldiers desperate not to be taken prisoner and marched off to Siberia. Meanwhile, Eisenhower shifted his focus, swinging the bulk of his army south towards Bavaria, where he expected the last Nazi diehards to collect. On the 21st of April, US and Soviet troops met at Torgay on the River Elbe, 70 miles to the west of Berlin, and within a week, all organized Nazi resistance had disintegrated. This came only a week or so after the Allies learnt of the death of President Roosevelt from a cerebral hemorrhage, with Harry Truman, his successor, inheriting both the final stages of the war in Europe and the burden of the Manhattan Project. By this time, Roosevelt's nemesis, Adolf Hitler, had become a sick, broken and deranged man. He had chosen to stay in Berlin, where from his bunker near the Reich Chancellery he commanded the last few loyal members of his personal staff. On the 30th of April, having designated Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, and with the Red Army only a few hundred miles away from the bunker, he watched his new bride, Eva Braun, kill herself by biting a cyanide capsule before killing himself with a gunshot to the head. The following day, Joseph Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children as they slept, before also taking their own lives. Following the formal signing of surrender documents, President Truman and Winston Churchill declared the 8th of May, 1945 VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, ending 6 years of war in Europe. As the war was ending, the liberation of concentration camp after concentration camp confirmed rumors of a final solution that had been circling since 1941 and the true horrors of Nazi rule. In January, the Red Army uncovered Auschwitz-Birkenau, while in April, the concentration camp at Bergen-Belsen was liberated by British troops, who found 40,000 prisoners barely alive, surrounded by the bodies of some 10,000 unburied and rotting corpses. In the weeks and months that followed, many other concentration camps catalogued crimes unprecedented in human history. By April 1945, the war in Europe against the German Nazis and the Italian fascists had been won, but the war against the Japanese militarists still continued, although successes in the Philippines, Burma, and a spring offensive by Chiang Kai-shek in China showed that the defeat of Japan was ultimately inevitable. The Allies were also helped as they drew closer to Japan by the capture of air bases that were quickly used to launch a massive bombing campaign against Japanese cities, ports, and industrial centers, most notably the March 1945 firebombing of Tokyo itself. This destroyed 16 square miles of the mainly wooden buildings of the capital, claiming over 100,000 lives, just one of many Japanese cities attacked as the war reached its conclusion. Three such air bases were taken on the island of Iwo Jima, fought over in February and March at the cost of 7,000 American lives. The fanaticism of the defense of the island left only 200 out of a garrison of some 18,000 men still alive. At the Battle of Okinawa, known as the Typhoon of Steel, and the last great battle of World War II, the US Navy suffered 1,500 kamikaze attacks launched on US ships. Over 82 days of fighting between April and June 1945, the battle claimed the lives of 12,000 Americans, 70,000 Japanese defenders, and 140,000 civilians, a civilian loss second only to Stalingrad. The ferocity of the fighting in Okinawa and elsewhere persuaded President Truman that a mainland invasion of Japan would involve catastrophic US casualties. This reality became clear to him as he steamed across the Atlantic to meet Stalin and Churchill for the Third Great Power Conference at Potsdam in July 1945 to discuss what to do with the defeated Germany. Churchill was accompanied by Clement Attlee, who replaced him as leader of the British delegation after the declaration of the Labour Party's landslide victory in the general election. As the leaders settled down to tense discussions in Germany, Truman received top-secret messages that the testing of the first of 3 atomic bombs in America's possession had on the 16th of July been successfully carried out in the New Mexico desert. This confirmed the success of the Manhattan Project, and that he now held the weapon that might force a Japanese surrender. On the 6th of August 1945, this bomb, which possessed the destructive capacity of 20,000 tons of TNT, was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The effects were staggering, with some 75,000 people dying instantly from the blast that destroyed most of the city. 3 days later, the final bomb in the US arsenal of just 3 was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, instantly killing a further 40,000. The Japanese government did not know that this third bomb was the last in the US stockpile, and fearing further attacks, sued for peace. The one condition that they requested was that Emperor Hirohito should be allowed to retain his imperial position. The US occupying force conducting negotiations accepted this, and on the 15th of August, General MacArthur and representatives of the Japanese government met on board the US aircraft carrier USS Missouri at anchor in Tokyo Harbor. It was here that the surrender documents ending the bloodiest war in history were signed.